Joseph Conrad's book, Heart of Darkness, keeps coming up, whether in conversation or just when you're reading online. Its powerful images and of course its core message is something you cannot forget once you've read the book. So much so that I decided to make a video about it. So if you're interested, keep watching. Heart of Darkness is often claimed to be one of the best books ever. It is number 24 on the greatest books of all time list at thegreatestbooks.org and number 92 at Penguin's 100 must-read classics as chosen by our readers. And while I view these lists or the books on these lists with some disbelief, I have to agree that this one is a fascinating must-read book. I have heard and read about Heart of Darkness repeatedly, most recently in connection with travel literature, as one of the best pieces of travel writing ever written. And so I read it, and now having read it, I'm a bit surprised because I do not see it as a travel literature, no more than, say, the Divine Comedy or the Odyssey. Yes, it involves traveling, that is, moving from one place to the other, but that is really not its point. Although in any great travel literature, perhaps moving from one place to the other is never the main point. There's always a spiritual or mental quest, and travel is merely a metaphor for that, acquiring a symbolic dimension because the journey is an inward one. Well, arguably all journeys are inward ones, and moving from one place to the other is merely a manifestation of that. But this line of thought is not necessarily that productive. In any case, having heard so much about this book, I finally took the time to read it. And earlier this week, I spent with colleagues 2 days in Brussels, which is a beautiful city. And the neighborhood we stayed in had a number of old colonial-style buildings, and these were simply gorgeous. Like this large Art Nouveau house, which was simply amazing. It was built in the mid-19th century and renovated in 1904. Everything in it projected style and wealth, and it is now also beautifully restored and has a restaurant and a bar. It was fascinating to think about this artistic and cultural milieu against the colonial background of this period. And this reminded me of Joseph Conrad's book. And this is the reason why you're watching this video now. Heart of Darkness is a short book. It's a novella rather than a novel. It describes the story of Charles Marlow, an English seaman, as he takes a job at a Belgian trading company and travels on a steamer up the River Congo in order to bring back one of the company's traders called Kurtz. As he gradually approaches Kurtz's station, he hears more and more about him, learning that he's an exceptionally charismatic person. And most people who know him personally are in awe of him. But he has gone wild or mad, and he's now being worshipped by the natives. When he finds him, it turns out that Kurtz is actually quite ill, and the natives don't want him to leave. And of course, Kurtz himself doesn't want to leave either. But they take him back onto the steamer, and as they get further and further away, he grows weaker and weaker and eventually dies. This is the scene of him dying in the book. Anything approaching the change that came over his features, I have never seen before, and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched, I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw on that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. Before dying, Kurtz gave Marlow some of his papers and correspondence. And these are the ones that are personal, and so he does not want the company to have. In fact, he insists that the company should not have them. It is almost as if he's trying to keep his professional life and everything connected to it, including the violence, separate from his personal life. Back in London, after having finished this assignment, Marlow goes to see Kurtz's fiancée, who is devastated by his death. And after talking to her, he decides not to tell her the truth. and instead says that Kurtz's last words were her name. And this contrast with Kurtz's real last words, the horror, is actually quite interesting, because it suggests that Marlow's last thoughts on his deathbed were linked to his personal life, to the things that were dear to him, whereas what really happened suggests the opposite, that he had become consumed by the horrible reality around him. My first impression of the book is how much it resembled the movie Apocalypse Now. And having looked it up, it turns out that yes, actually there is a connection. In fact, the movie is based on this very novel. Only it is set in Vietnam and Cambodia. But even the name of the officer who the protagonist is supposed to bring back is Colonel Kurtz. And even though I've seen the movie several times, until I read the book, I had no idea about this connection. Another thing that is immediately obvious in the novella is its structure, which builds up a number of parallels between civilized and uncivilized worlds. It begins on a boat on the River Thames before moving upstream to London, and the English seaman Charles Marlow comments to the others on how when the Romans were here, this whole place was an uncivilized, dark place. These thoughts and this background is the frame of the story, describing him traveling on a steamer up the Congo. And with this setting, he kind of makes the point that England, which is often seen as one of the most civilized places in the world, was once just like the Congo. The colonial powers themselves were once just groups of savages when looked at by the Romans. And so the roles change, and who is civilized or who is a savage really depends on who is looking and when. This layered frame structure of the book is actually quite apparent. It begins in England, near London, and it ends in London. And of course there's a strong parallel between traveling up the Thames to London and traveling up the Congo into the jungle, into the place referred to in the book as the Heart of Darkness. Once in the Congo, as Marlow gets closer and closer to Kurtz's place, he hears more and more about him. And almost nothing of that is solid facts. There are rumors, legends, even myths about him. And so the tension heightens, and it seems that we're zooming in on something. And that something is, of course, the Heart of Darkness. And as the other side of this layer of the frame is his movement in the opposite direction. Having retrieved Marlow, they travel downstream the river. It is as if we were zooming out. And Kurtz increasingly loses his vitality as he is traveling further away from his station, where the natives worship him. It is almost as if the place had some magical power that kept him alive. And the very fact of moving away from it drains the life out of him. It is not that going back to civilization deprives him of some of his power or influence, but that he is physically incapable of returning to civilization. He had crossed the threshold and had reached a point of no return. And so he dies on the steamer while moving downstream. Equally fascinating is the reserved, dispassionate manner in which Marlow retells the whole story. This low-key, restrained tone creates a powerful contrast with the brutality and cruelty it describes. The entire story is told by Marlow in the first person, and the reader is constantly reminded of this by the fact that each new paragraph begins with a quotation mark. And so this is a very useful technical device that keeps the perspective in focus. Using a separate narrator, on the one hand, creates a distance between what is being said and the author, and on the other, it creates another layer of frame around the story. All in all, Marlow is taken aback by the cruelty inflicted on the natives. Lots of them are dying because of sheer exhaustion. Others are being shot at from a gunboat. And he remarks with surprise that these people are being called the enemy or criminals. But they're just natives, and there's something comical about using such words for them. Yet Marlow does not seem to express much sympathy for the natives. This is not his primary concern. In fact, the natives are not given much voice in this book. They're only kind of described as part of the setting. Because of course the Europeans are also dying right and left. And part of the effectiveness of these descriptions lies in the fact that they are presented in a very simple, non-sentimental manner as an ordinary state of affairs. So in this sense, if the book has an anti-colonial agenda, it is not out of compassion for the natives. The writer seems to be more interested in this contrast between civilized and uncivilized worlds, and perhaps in how the so-called savages might not actually be real savages. But the protagonist is not racist either. He does not seem to be interested in race at all. The natives are not dehumanized. He does not describe the natives in much detail, just as he does not describe Marlow's companions on the English boat on the Thames. So what is my overall impression of the book? I think it is fantastic, beautifully written, describing a dark and haunting world which you cannot unsee once you've read the book. And if you read it, do it with an open mind, as an exploration of the human condition, rather than as a commentary on specific events in colonial history. The novella is, of course, now part of this whole discourse on colonialism, and this is how it is taught in schools, but it is also a powerful piece of literature in its own right. Okay, let me know what you think of the book if you read it, and subscribe if you haven't, and please like the video, and perhaps you could even turn on notifications so you're notified when new videos come online. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.